Hello, this is the third annual Apologetics Seminar of Grace Christian Church, and this would be the first one that we're actually doing online. Previous years, we've always done it at the church, in the sanctuary, and we're hoping to do that again in the future. But this year, we're trying a new format. Please let us know what it is that you think. And after you watch this video, please feel free to leave any comments in the comment section on YouTube or any comments on the Facebook section, because I want to also be able to answer your questions. You can also email me. My email will be at the end of the presentation, or come to me personally if you have any questions at all. I'll be more than happy to answer them. Usually there is actually a question and answer period after these presentations, but this year, because of this particular format, I don't really know how to do a live presentation with PowerPoint. So we're not going to be having the Q&A right after the presentation. Rather, we're just send me any questions that you can, and if you send me enough questions, I'll try to do a video in the future addressing those questions. But this year, the topic that we are talking about is the question, why does God allow suffering? And this is known as the problem of evil. So what do we mean by the problem of evil? Well, the term problem of evil is an official term that is used to describe what many consider to be the primary argument against the existence of God. It is in fact the most popular argument by atheists. You'll hear it all the time. It can also be used, though, by people who are still religious but are arguing against Christianity in particular. And this is because Christianity and Judaism not only believe in the existence of God, but insist on the consistent and perfect character of God. It is his attribute of goodness that is being targeted by the argument. And the argument, in all of its forms, basically runs like this. God would not permit the evil that we see in the world. We see lots of evil in the world, but God would not permit it. And yet it's there. Therefore, God must not exist. Now, this very basic dichotomy can be presented in a variety of different ways, and we're going to be going over this very variety. But it all boils down to this basic concept that God wouldn't let evil exist. Therefore, the fact that evil does exist implies, at the very least, that God isn't there to stop it. Now, there are lots of different responses, but the precise response that you give is going to have to be tailored to the version of the problem of evil that you're actually presented. So let's actually start looking at these different versions of the problem of evil. So the first argument that we're going to be talking about, the first version, is the emotional problem of evil. Now, when most people talk about the problem of evil, they're talking about the logical problem of evil, which is what we're going to be discussing throughout most of this presentation. But personally, I think the main argument is what's sometimes referred to as the emotional problem of evil. And the emotional problem of evil has to do with why is it that these things have happened. It's about appealing to our emotions. Why is it that my son got sick? Why is it that my mother has been in the nursing home? Why is it that I was in that horrible car accident? Why did my uncle lose his job? These kinds of questions, these kinds of pains that we're dealing with, we want God to answer it. We want God to tell us, why do these things happen? And we don't know. We don't know the answer to that. And that frustration causes us to take heed of the overall argument of the problem of evil. It attracts us to it. See, what ends up happening is that the emotional problem of evil is therefore able to be much more specific than the logical problem of evil, because the logical problem of evil is always talking about suffering in general. But the emotional one, because it's appealing to our emotions, it's really drawing on things that are very, very personal and very, very specific. And that's incredibly powerful precisely because it's persuading us by using our emotions, because our emotions are incredibly powerful things. Now, many apologists become dismissive of the emotional problem of evil because, well, we shouldn't be making conclusions off of our emotions. We should be making conclusions off of logic and reasoning. However, 2 points. Number one, just because you think somebody shouldn't be having an opinion because of emotions won't actually stop them from having an opinion because of their emotions. If they believe something for emotional reasons, you have to address those emotional reasons, whether you like it or not. But 2, because I'm a Christian, I'm actually someone who takes our emotions very seriously. Our emotions were given to us by God for a reason. And because of that, we ought to respect our emotions. And we ought to respect emotional argumentation. But it should be done in a way that understands it. So I'm going to give a brief defense of emotions. First and foremost, the first purpose that emotions have is that they help us with short-term decision making. Imagine, for instance, that you're walking through a jungle. And as you're walking through a jungle, just casually, suddenly you see this. Now, what should your response be? Should you kind of stop and assess and think of all the possible ways in which you can solve the problem which is now facing you? Should you pull out a piece of paper or pull out a chart and analyze all the possible options available to you? Or should you act immediately? The answer is you should act immediately, and your emotions help you to do precisely that. They help you to decide what you're going to do in the moment when something has to be done. They're incredibly good at that. And this is especially true of our powerful emotions like anger and fear. They help us to act immediately when an action needs to happen immediately. However, it's not just these powerful emotions that help us with short-term decision making. A lot of people talk about their ability to trust their gut. And precisely what that means is that they're trusting their emotions, that they're allowing their emotions to make a decision in the moment. And if you're someone who's trained your emotions up, if you're someone who has tested your emotions and followed them sometimes and know when they lead you astray and when they don't lead you astray, so you have a better sense of what they're telling you, you're actually someone who can trust your gut pretty accurately. And we've all seen people like that, people who seem to follow their gut and they tend to make wise decisions based off of that. And there's a training that goes on with that. And this is because our emotions are very good at making quick assessment and deciding things in the moment. Now, I don't think that somebody should trust their gut when it comes to long-term decision making. But when it comes to short-term decision making, it can be incredibly accurate. Another way in which emotions help us with short-term decision making is reading other people. In social circumstances, the communication that's going on is more than just the words that we're speaking. It also involves all sorts of tone in your voice and your body movements and your facial expressions. And there's so much data that you have to pull in and assess that you can't do it all consciously. Therefore, our emotions are an excellent tool to help us assess the social dynamics of what's going on around us. So that's another area where we're able to make short-term decisions in terms of the conversation that we're having in a moment that our emotions help us make. Now, the second purpose of emotions is that emotions serve as a kind of moral check on our logic. When we do something wrong, we are incredibly good at justifying it. We're very good at it. You know, when we're looking at somebody else, we don't make the same kinds of justifications because, of course, when we're talking about ourselves, there's all sorts of information that we're able to factor in that we can't factor in when we're talking about somebody else. But the problem is that because we're so good at this kind of justification, we need to have the discipline to put ourselves in other people's shoes and kind of feel how they're going to respond to what we're doing, and use that as a kind of check on our logic, on our reasoning. We don't want to explain away what is right. And we don't want to excuse logically what is wrong. And our emotions help us do that. We can actually kind of think of our emotions as a kind of moral sense. In the same way that we use our hearing to detect the world around us, we can use our emotions to detect what is right and what is wrong. Now, I kind of think of it like this, that our emotions are sort of like our hearing, and our logic is like our sight. Our sight is much more precise than our hearing. All right? Generally, when it comes to what we see, we see with a great deal of precision. However, our hearing is able to detect things that our sight doesn't pick up. And so there's great value in our hearing, but our hearing isn't quite as accurate. So think about it for a moment. If someone were to come up to you and tell you that because your hearing is not nearly as precise as your sight, you ought to just ignore your hearing entirely. Just live life only paying attention to what you see and completely ignore that which you hear. That sounds ridiculous, and it is ridiculous. And this is the way that people who say that we shouldn't trust emotions at all, this is what they sound like to me. No, we should balance out our emotions and our logic. The third thing that our emotions help with is motivation. Our emotions push us, and they can push us hard. Sometimes we really don't want to do something, but if we have an emotional reason to move, our emotions make us move fast. And we all know that sometimes we can actually utilize this to our advantage. Like if you need to lose weight, if you need to get healthy, you know you need to exercise, you know you need to eat well, and logically this makes total sense. But none of us really want to do it. If you want to really get healthy, you need to have an emotional reason to do it, so that you have the kind of motivation that will actually push you into exercising and push you into eating well. Now, all of this I'm saying is why the emotional problem of evil ought to be respected, and why I also think that this is the most powerful version of the argument. But because it's the most powerful version, I want to go over the other versions before I explain what I think our response to this ought to be. So I'm actually going to return to this at the very end of the presentation, but I want you to have the emotional problem of evil in the back of your mind as I'm going through this, because I'm going to be bringing things up, and you might think in your head, well, that doesn't really address the heart of this. It doesn't really address the morality of this. But I'm going to be getting to that, and I'm going to be getting to it at the very end. So just hold on to it for now and recognize that we need to understand what the logical approaches are so that we can properly understand what our response needs to be for the emotional problem of evil. So turning now to the logical problem of evil, the first version that we're going to look at is the deductive version. And the deductive version is the one that is the most formal in its reasoning. It was first developed by the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus. And the idea is to demonstrate that God can't exist. It's impossible for God to exist. And the reason why it's impossible for God to exist is because there is a logical contradiction. To prove that something doesn't exist, one of the most common ways is in fact to use logical contradiction. A famous example is a math proof of why the square root of 2 is not a rational number. Because in order for something to be a rational number, it has to be able to be represented as a fraction between two integers. And that these two integers, at least one of them has to be odd, because otherwise you could divide both by 2. Now, what's interesting about the proof, because I'm not going to get into this because this isn't a math class, but if you look at premise 5 and the conclusion 11, you can see that this operates as a contradiction, that both the dominator and the denominator of the fraction both have to be even. And it's impossible for both the numerator and denominator to be even. And because it's impossible for them both to be even, it's impossible for the square root of 2 to be rational. This is what's known as a proof that uses logical contradiction. So the logical problem of evil, this deductive version of it, tries to show this exact same kind of contradiction. Now the claim that's being made is that the existence of God and the existence of evil is in fact a contradiction. They are incompatible ideas. They are mutually exclusive. So how exactly is this done? Let's look at the argument. So let us start at the very beginning. Premise 1. God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good. Premise 2. If God is all-powerful, he'll be able to stop any evil. Premise 3. If God is all-knowing, he'll know how to stop any evil. Premise 4. If God is perfectly good, he would want to stop all evil. Premise 5. If God exists, then evil will not exist. Premise 6. Evil exists. Conclusion, therefore, God does not exist. Now, when we look at the conclusion, therefore God does not exist, where exactly does this reasoning come from? Where does this conclusion come from? And it comes from these last two premises of the argument, that if God exists, then evil will not exist, and evil exists. This formulation, this structure, is classically known as modus ponens, where the negation of the second half of the if-then statement means that the first half is also negated. So the fact that evil will not exist is shown to be false by premise 6, therefore God exists would also be demonstrated to be false. That's the basic reasoning, and that is logically valid. That means that if we think that premise 5 and premise 6 are both true, then premise 7 necessarily follows. Additionally, premise 6 is evidentially true. We know that evil exists. We experience it all the time. That means that this entire argument hangs on the question of whether or not premise 5 is true. And that is based off of premises 1 through 4. 1 through 4 are attempting to show that premise 5 is true. So let us look at those. First of all, premise 1. God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good. This comes directly out of the definition of God, and this is uncontroversial. This is basically how we define God. Or at least we all define God as having these particular attributes. So there's no problem there. Let's look at premise 2. If God is all-powerful, he'll be able to stop any evil. Is that true? Well, not really. Not in a way that matters. I mean, it's certainly true that if God is all-powerful, he would be able to stop any particular evil from occurring. That's fine, because he could stop any event from occurring, period. But does that mean he'd be able to stop any evil in such a way that he could guarantee another evil doesn't happen? Which is what you'd actually need in order for the argument to go through. And the answer to that is no. Many of us, when we think of God being all-powerful or God being omnipotent, we kind of define that as meaning that God can do anything. A very simple way of thinking about it. And that's a rough and ready definition. For everyday life, that's okay. But when we're talking about philosophical precision, we find that that definition doesn't really work. And this is because God can't do things that are logically impossible. God being all-powerful, God being omnipotent, what that means is that God has an unlimited reserve of power. That there is nothing in the world, there's no event that can happen that he himself could not cause, right? But things that can't happen at all, things that just make no sense, well, that's not a power problem. That's a logic problem. We can't expect God to be able to make a square circle, because putting those two words together in a sentence, it doesn't really mean anything. We think we've made a sentence, but we haven't really. It lacks actual meaningful content. This is true also if we ask, can God make a married bachelor? Or can God make 2 + 2 = 6? The answer to all these questions is no. God can't do those kinds of things, because when you look into them, when you try to understand them on a precise level, you find that there actually isn't any meaning behind those. When we say that God is all-powerful, that means that there's no limit to what he can accomplish in the world, not that he can perform illogical and nonsensical actions. So the question is, does this actually apply to evil? Can we actually say that God stopping all evil results in such a contradiction? And we seem to be able to say yes, because we all are aware of the concept of moral dilemmas, that a lot of times we're presented with a scenario where we have to choose one thing that we think is bad and another thing which we think is worse. For many of us, we have to do this every 4th November. So we have that coming up soon. We're all used to the idea that we have to choose the lesser of two evils. But it's not just in elections where that's true. In everyday life, a lot of times we have to make moral decisions where we have to choose something that we actually don't like, that we think is wrong, but that us not doing that will result in a greater wrong. And there's no reason to think that God could never find himself in such a situation. We could insist on that. You could claim that God can't find himself in those kinds of situations. But I'm hesitant to think that. Like, in my mind, you would have to prove that. And for the atheist, you have to ask the question, fine, prove that it's impossible for God to find himself in moral dilemmas. And I don't think you can do it. And one of the things that we're going to find later on in this very slide when we address premise 4 is that I think I can actually present such a scenario where God does find himself in such moral dilemmas. So I don't think there's any real reason to think that premise 2 is true. What about premise 3? Is premise 3 true? If God is all-knowing, he would know how to stop any evil. Well, this falls victim to the exact same analysis that we had in premise 2. Like, are you saying that God will know how to stop any particular evil? Sure. But does that mean that God would know how to stop any evil in such a way that some other greater evil wouldn't occur? Well, that's assuming that there actually is a way to stop that particular evil without some other evil from occurring. That's a mighty bold assumption that you would have to actually demonstrate, that there is in fact always a way out in which no evil happens. I mean, certainly God could create the world in which there doesn't exist any moral creatures at all, where it's just him and nothing else. But I think it'd be a great good for God to create the world, even if the ramifications of that is having some bad apples. So I don't think it actually follows that it's necessarily true that if God is all-knowing, he would know a solution to any problem where no bad things happen as a result. So premise 2 doesn't seem to be true, and premise 3 doesn't seem to be true either. So what about premise 4? If God is perfectly good, he would want to stop all evil. No, I don't think that's true at all. And the reason for this is that sometimes certain evils are actually necessary in order to accomplish certain kinds of goods. And if those goods are sufficiently good, then it would be wrong of God to not have those evils happen, because then the good wouldn't happen. Alvin Plantinga, he's a famous philosopher. In the 1960s, he developed an argument known as the free will defense. And in this argument, what he claimed is that it may be true that it's impossible to create creatures with libertarian free will that never do anything wrong. At the very act of making it so that it's impossible for something to do wrong requires that thing to not have libertarian free will. But it's then argued that libertarian free will is actually a great good. Not a good that God has to create, but it is good enough. It is a reasonable enough good that God is justified for wanting to make creatures that have free will, that are able to actually make their own decisions and are able to actually enter into relationships with God himself. That seems to be a good that is worthy of God making, even if the result of that is that there are some evils that end up happening for a time. So therefore, it seems that premise 4 is certainly not true, and is not true in such a way that it actually shows precisely the kind of moral dilemmas that made us suspect that premises 2 and 3 weren't true. So where does that leave us? If premises 2, 3, and 4 do not appear to be true, then we have no reason in thinking that premise 5 is true. And if we have no reason in thinking that premise 5 is true, we have no reason in thinking that the conclusion is true. Therefore, we're still perfectly justified in believing that God exists. Now, it's worth pointing out at this point that Alvin Plantinga's argument is considered to be so strong and so powerful that among professional philosophers, among the people who are experts on these kinds of things, this argument, the deductive problem of evil, is considered to be practically dead. I mean, nothing truly dies in philosophy, but it's as dead as an argument can get. That is how powerful the free will defense actually is. So if atheists were going to try to recover the problem of evil as an argument against God's existence, they were going to have to find some way around Alvin Plantinga's free will defense. So let's look at their first attempt of actually doing so. So the first of these attempts is what we can call the probable problem of evil. This is a relatively recent argument. I mean, there are signs of it beforehand, but since Alvin Plantinga's free will defense, this has become the most premier version of the problem of evil. And it works by attempting to lower the bar for what the atheist actually has to prove. Instead of being able to prove that the existence of morality and the existence of God are completely incompatible, instead, it merely attempts to show that God's existence is improbable, that it's unlikely that God would exist considering the evil that we see. And it does that by claiming that the amount or the degree of evil that we see is unnecessary or superfluous. Okay, fine, God wants free will creatures, so therefore there has to be a certain amount of rebellion that's possible, a certain amount of sin that's going to be in the world. But does that justify allowing the Holocaust to happen? Does that justify allowing a pandemic to happen? Does that justify the existence of live-action Disney remakes? I mean, doesn't that seem to be a bit much? Couldn't God allow free will creatures to exist while also stopping these kinds of evils from occurring? Now, this argument doesn't really require a logical formula because it's kind of obvious how it works. It's the same logic as the deductive problem of evil. All it merely attempts to do is lower the bar of making everything probable. So let us actually look at how we can respond to this. So before we go into direct responses, there's a couple of points I want to bring up. First, burden of proof. Now, most of us are familiar with this concept when we're talking about the legal realm, right? So the prosecution has the burden of proof, which means that the defense attorney doesn't have to prove that their client is innocent. All they have to do is claim that the prosecution hasn't proven that their client is guilty. This is what is also referred to as the presumption of innocence. So in the context of a conversation or in a philosophical debate, which side is it that has the burden of proof? Now, you will often hear atheists make the claim that it's the affirmative case that has the burden of proof. Now, this is technically true, but the problem is that they don't know what that term means. They think that the affirmative case is the positive case. So when we say that God does exist, that's the positive case. But they think that that's what the affirmative case is, but it's not. The affirmative case is the case that affirms the conclusion of the argument that's being discussed, which means that the burden of proof rests on the person presenting the argument. And this makes sense. I mean, it just makes simple sense. No matter what it is that you're trying to convince me of, if you're trying to convince me of something, there's no reason why I need to change my mind unless you convince me. And it doesn't matter whether you're making a positive claim or a negative claim. If you come to me and you tell me that the sky isn't blue, the burden of proof doesn't somehow lie on me because I think the sky is blue. That's not the way this works. That's not the way any of this works. All right, the burden of proof rests on the person who's presenting the argument, the one who's trying to change the person's mind. So when we look at the problem of evil, who is it that is affirming the conclusion of the argument? It's not the theist, it's the atheist, or whoever else it is that's presenting this argument. That's the person with the burden of proof. Now, this doesn't in of itself demonstrate that the probabilistic problem of evil is bad. It's not a flaw. It's just something that you need to keep in mind when we're actually looking at the responses. That it's not our responsibility to prove that the probabilistic problem of evil fails. It's their responsibility to show that it succeeds. The second thing to remember is the fact that there are arguments for God's existence as well. This argument doesn't exist in a vacuum. There are other arguments. Probabilistic arguments are, by nature, not knockdown arguments. The only thing that a probabilistic argument would do is that it would lower the probability of God existing. But that also means that if there are arguments for God's existence, they can counterbalance this argument. So even if it's true, even if the argument goes through and it makes God's existence improbable, the fact that there are other arguments for God's existence can override the improbability of the problem of evil. And there are lots of arguments for God's existence. You have the cosmological arguments, the theological arguments, the argument for morality, the argument for mathematics or semiotics, also the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. We have good reasons to think that God exists. And I would argue that many of these arguments, and certainly these arguments cumulatively, are more powerful than the probabilistic problem of evil is. So I do think that these arguments offset the probabilistic problem of evil, even if it were to succeed. But now let's actually look into direct challenges to the probabilistic argument. First of all, let's look again at this sentence, all right? I mentioned before that the way this argument works is that it does this by claiming that the amount or degree of evil that we see is unnecessary or superfluous. But let us consider these two words in particular, unnecessary and superfluous. Unnecessary or superfluous for what exactly? Do we know what God's plan is? Do we know everything that God is doing? Do we know what God's mental calculations are? Not really. When it comes right down to it, we are not in a place to know what God's final goals are exactly. I mean, we know generally certain things about God's final goals from Scripture, but we don't know the full details of things. And therefore, we're not really in a place where we can know what is and is not necessary for those plans, or what is and is not superfluous for those plans. Some event that's happening today might have an effect 100, 200, 3,000 years into the future. Can we actually see that? Can we see what the event that's happening in front of me is actually going to have? Like, what is that effect hundreds or thousands of years hence? Not really. And if God is planning that far in advance, then we can't just simply look at the event that's in front of us and say yay or nay, God exists or doesn't exist. God would or would not allow this. We don't know what his final goals are. The other thing that is important to consider is that Christianity itself has certain answers for this. For instance, this life is not all that there is. We know that there is an eternal life that is coming. And what that means is that all the evil, all of the destruction, all of the pain that we're dealing with today will be nothing in eternity. In the song Amazing Grace, the last verse says, "When we've been there 10,000 years, light shining as the sun, we'd have no less days to sing God's praise than when we had first begun." When we were children, we tripped and fell. When we were children, we experienced pain and frustration. And from those innocent days, we thought that this little bit of pain, this little bit of suffering is the worst thing that could possibly happen to me. And yet, by this point in our lives, when we're adults, those horrible things seem trivial, if they are remembered at all. And it's hard to imagine that the pain and the suffering that we are enduring today could, thousands of years hence, not somehow still be relevant. But also think there's a very high possibility that there is. A pain that we had 10,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, when the vast majority of our eternal life has been pure good. It would seem trivial by that point. Now, that's not to say that it isn't trivial now. When my child gets hurt today, I sit down with him and I comfort him and I take his bumps and bruises seriously. Because they are serious when they happen. But that isn't to say that they're so serious or so bad that they really are the worst thing that could possibly happen, or that it completely upends any future goods that are going to occur in his life. A second point is that this life isn't about comfort or happiness. That seems to be the belief that a lot of people have when it comes to the problem of evil. Just like, well, our lives should be better than this. Our lives should be comfortable. Why exactly? I mean, how are we going about deciding which things are evil and which things are not evil? I really like the way that William Lane Craig says this. He says, we are not God's pets. God didn't make us to put us in a nice little cage and then give us food and shelter and little wheels to run on and just sort of sit back and watch and see how adorable we are. We're not little guinea pigs to God. We are his children. He calls us sons and daughters. And you don't treat your children like that. You want your children to grow. You want your children to become wise. You want your children to become strong. You want to see what they're capable of. And in order for that to happen, you have to give them a bit of distance. And that does mean have to allow them to endure a little frustration in life. So it's not necessarily true on a Christian perspective that we should expect great comfort. In fact, the Bible promises suffering. The Bible says that we will suffer for our faith. There is nowhere in the Bible that says that God's plan for you is for everything to go swimmingly. It says precisely the opposite. And we shouldn't complain when the promises of God end up coming true. The last thing to remember when thinking about this is that this world, as we currently experience it, is not the world that God designed. Mankind has rebelled against God. And that rebellion has caused many, many problems. And that means that a lot of the evil that God allows to occur, he allows to occur because he is patient, desiring for people to repent. and that you and me, who think that we're so good and think that we're so innocent, are not nearly as innocent as we like to think that we are. All have sinned, which means that the innocent aren't the ones who suffer, because there aren't innocents, except for Jesus himself. And he willingly died on a cross. So we have to ask the question, all right, exactly what is a reasonable quantity of evil? Exactly what does that look like? Given the rebellion of mankind, considering the great good that's going to happen in eternal life, considering that at this point, life is not all about comfort and happiness, and considering that we don't have the full knowledge to be able to adjudicate these things, how are you calculating out how good the world is supposed to be? How do you know this? And I personally think that we're just simply not in a position to know it. There's no reason to conclude that the amount of evil in the world is actually superfluous. And therefore, I don't really think this argument works. So earlier, when we were looking at the deductive problem of evil, we noticed how in professional circles, this argument is now practically dead, especially because of Alvin Plantinga's free will defense. So the probabilistic problem of evil attempted to do an end run around this by instead lowering the burden of proof, saying that we're not trying to prove that God doesn't exist, but only that he probably doesn't exist. But there's another technique that you can use. Instead of saying that God can't exist with evil, instead saying that God can't exist with certain kinds of evil. Now, the natural problem of evil attempts to avoid the problem of evil issues precisely with this kind of specificity. And it noticed that the free will defense and the various other kinds of answers that Christians give, such as human rebellion and our future hope, and those kinds of things, all focus on humanity's role in evil. But what if we considered the certain kinds of evils in the world that are not actually caused by humans? For instance, what about forest fires, or hurricanes, or viruses? These are things that are certainly evils in the sense that they are destructive. But they're not caused by human sin, or certainly not directly anyway. So wouldn't these things therefore not be because of us, but instead because of God? If human beings are not responsible for them, then God must be responsible for them. God is responsible for these kinds of evils, or so the argument goes. But that would mean that God is doing something evil, and God can't do something evil. Therefore, the existence of these kinds of evils demonstrate that God doesn't exist. Well, how would we respond to this? So when we looked at the deductive problem of evil, we examined the argument that's called the free will defense. So the first response I want to make for the natural problem of evil is what I refer to as the free physics defense. See, many of the things that we complain about, such as hurricanes, such as earthquakes, are simply a result of physics actually happening. Why are there earthquakes? Well, because there are tectonic plates, and tectonic plates are necessary for life to actually really work the way that it does in the world. So it's good that earthquakes can happen, even if it's unfortunate that they happen when they do and upsetting towards us. So we can't just simply look at these things and say, aha, this is some evil, terrible thing. No, physics have to work. I mean, if we as human beings are going to live meaningfully moral lives, the world has to be predictable. We have to know that things happen in a certain way. Like if I'm carrying around a rock, or if this child is carrying around a rock, and it drops and falls on my foot, I can't say, well, how could God create gravity in such a way that this rock has now crushed my pinky? I don't get to say that, because Gravity works the way that it does because it's the way that gravity needs to work. If it didn't work that way, if it was always changing all the time, then how can we actually make the kinds of decisions that we need to make in life? Because everything would just be random. We wouldn't be able to predict it. We wouldn't be able to actually make appropriate decisions. The world has to be predictable. In fact, what this basically means is that if we are to say that God shouldn't allow these things to happen, then we would have to be able to demonstrate a different set of physical laws that would work better, right? I mean, it makes sense that God lets the physics engine run. Can you create a better physics engine than the one that we have? Can you actually do it better? I don't think so. And if we did have a different physics engine, I'm sure there would still be these kinds of natural disasters, these kinds of natural problems. The second point I want to make, and this one's a bit more controversial, is that God actually has the right to punish societies. I mean, we don't like to hear this. We like to say, no, God is always nice, God is always gentle, God never actually would hurt anybody. But that's not true. God is king, and God does punish. And we see in the Old Testament that he does actually punish people. Not every bad thing that happens is an evil. Some bad things that happen are indeed punishments. And we see in the Bible that the way in which God does tend to punish nations is often through these kinds of natural disasters. Now you can say, oh, but that's mean. It's mean for God to do that. Well, is it? I mean, I understand that a lot of times when these natural disasters happen, that innocent people get caught up in the midst of it. But the thing is that he's punishing these nations precisely because the innocent people are already suffering. It's already happening. So when God comes in and he punishes a wicked nation, he always does it when it's actually justified. What should God do instead? Should God leave wicked nations to just simply do wicked things? Should God never punish the wicked? I don't think so. I think that we can trust God to only punish nations when it is necessary. And we always find in the Bible that he's actually very, very slow to bring the punishment onto the nation. The third point I want to bring up is anthropocentrism. And this is the idea that we have a tendency to think that we as human beings are the center of the universe, that we're the most important things, that the decisions that affect humanity are more important than the decisions that affect the birds or the animals or the plants. But that's not really God's perspective. While God does love us, and while we do have an elevated status in creation, we are not actually his only concern. In the book of Job, when God meets up with Job at the end in the whirlwind, and Job has been challenging God and saying, why have you allowed this evil thing to happen to me? The response that God gives is precisely this response. He says, look at the deer in the field. Look at the goats up on top of the mountain. I have my eye on every single one of them. I'm taking care of all of them. I mean, yes, I'm also taking care of you, but can you actually balance the concerns of every living thing on the earth? Can you balance the concerns of all of nature? And the answer to that, according to Job, is clearly no. Job said, oh, that's a good point. There's a lot in this world that I do not understand, that I cannot appreciate. And a lot of times the reason why natural disasters happen is because nature itself needs to be taken care of. Sometimes the reason it rains on your picnic is because the plants need water. Sometimes the reason a forest fire happens is to keep the forest clear. Sometimes these kinds of things naturally need to happen. So this then brings us to our last point. Because after all, if these things need to happen, why doesn't God just simply warn us? Why doesn't God just simply tell us when these things are about to happen so we can stay clear? And the other thing that we have to remember is that the earth itself isn't finished. This state of things, the way the earth is right now, and our relationship to the earth, is not the way it's supposed to be. We're supposed to be taking care of the earth in accordance to God's wisdom. But instead we take care of the earth in according to our own wisdom. And often we just simply don't do a very good job. But if we had God's view of nature, then yes, we would be able to avoid a lot of these natural disasters. And many of these natural disasters would actually be avoided because we'll be able to take care of the earth better. Paul at one point says this, "Yet what we suffer now is nothing compared to the glory he will reveal to us later. For all creation is waiting eagerly for that future day when God will reveal who his children really are. Against its will, all creation was subjected to God's curse. But with eager hope, the creation looks forward to the day when it will join God's children in glorious freedom from death and decay." We are not the only ones that are suffering under the fall of man. All of creation does. And so even a lot of the natural evils that exist in the world are as bad as they are because of human sin and will one day be rectified. So let us now look at a special case of natural evil. And this special case is the concept of predation. You see, it's actually full of all sorts of suffering due to the fact that animals hunt one another for food. And this is known as predation, the predator-prey relationship that exists. I mean, if you've watched Zootopia, I'm sure you have some understanding of this. And the thing about predation, which is different than the other natural evils that we're talking about, is that a lot of these animals are fundamentally designed to be able to eat other animals. Predation is not just simply a side feature of the design of animals. It is directly part of what they're supposed to be. You look at a cat and you don't think, oh, I bet at one point this thing actually ate plants. No, this thing is clearly designed to eat other animals. It is, you could argue, perfected to do precisely that. So that leads the question. How do we answer this? And like a lot of the other answers that we have, a lot of the other objections to the problem of evil that have been presented, we can say that we're not really in a place to know why God allows this to happen. Anything that we have to say about this, anything that we have to say of why predation exists, ultimately has to be a guess. But still, we can make some guesses. So I'll present you with three. One is this concept called neo-Cartesianism. And this is to say that animals don't actually suffer the way that we think that they suffer. We have found that while it is true that animals do in fact endure pain, I mean, they feel pain, they know that something is bad, sure, that's very, very true. But it appears that only primates and humans are actually aware of themselves as experiencing pain. Like other animals, while they are experiencing it, they're not going, oh, I'm in pain and how horrible this is. They're just simply saying, oh, I have to get away from this. Oh, I have to avoid this. Oh, I have to make this stop. And that's about as far as they can go. And this is kind of interesting because to some degree, that's what's actually necessary for things to be suffering. I mean, a lot of us experience pain. Like the other day, I hit my pinky on a nail, and it hurt. It hurt a lot more than it probably should have. But did I really suffer? Well, no, because the experience of pain is not actually the same thing as the experience of suffering. I mean, when I go to a gym and I start weightlifting, I hurt afterwards. But that pain isn't the same thing as suffering. in order for pain to actually result in suffering, there just simply has to be that ability to reflect upon it and see it as something which is unjust or see it as something which is depressing. And it doesn't seem like animals have the capacity to experience pain on that level, on the level that they can actually say to be suffering. And this is very true when you think of flies. I mean, can you think of a fly really suffering when it dies? I don't. So it doesn't seem to be quite the same thing, the same level. We can consider this to be a kind of protection that God has given to prey, to protect them from suffering. Another point is that for those who are creationists, this actually isn't even an example. I mean, because all predation from a creationist perspective usually is considered to be a result of the fall. That, before the fall, sure, now when we look at a cat, it's built clearly for hunting, but the cat is actually based off of some earlier version, some earlier feline version that did eat plants. So for those who are creationists, this isn't even a counterexample. This still comes from human sin. But even if you're not a creationist, you can still look at evolution, and even creationists believe that things evolve. You can still look at evolution and say that the kind of diversity that we end up getting from the evolutionary process may actually be considered to be worth it. There's a lot of beauty in the world that comes from the diversity of life that happens from animals adapting to various environments. So can we actually really say that predation is evil in the same way that a lot of these other evils are? Because at the end of the day, animals are not people. They're not humans, and they don't experience the world the same way that we do. And so morality isn't quite the same. That doesn't mean that we can torture them or those kinds of things. They're God's creatures. We need to care for them, and we need to love them simply because they belong to Him and we love Him. But at the same time, it doesn't appear to be the same kind of problem as what we have with the other issues of evil that we've been talking about. Now, if you're interested in this question of predation, I do have a book in my library called Nature Red in Tooth and Claw. This book is out of print, but if you are interested in looking at it and reading it, let me know, and I'll help you be able to read it. So let us now return to the emotional problem of evil. Throughout this presentation, we have seen that there are strong and powerful responses to the logical problem of evil. For instance, we've seen that the burden of proof is on the person who's making the argument. We have seen that, generally speaking, we are not in a position to know why God allows some things to happen. We have seen that human free will is a probable explanation for most of the evil that we see in the world, and that natural laws, which are inherently good, can account for a lot of the natural disasters and tragedies that are in the world. And also to simply remember that God's governance is about more than just making us comfortable. And these are only some of the responses. These are only some of the answers we've had to the logical problem of evil. But then I have a question, and it's simply this. If these answers are so strong and so powerful, why are they not completely satisfying? I mean, I've talked to a lot of people about the problem of evil. They come to me and they ask me, why did God allow this to happen? Why did God allow my grandmother to die? Why did God allow this child to get hurt? Why did God allow these events in Africa to happen, or these other tragedies? Why do we have to deal with the coronavirus? Why? And these are good questions. And when I attempt to answer these kinds of questions with these logical responses, I just get a glazed look. They can't hear it. And it's not because they don't care. And it's not because they're not logical. It's because at the end of the day, the problem of evil is not a logical challenge. It is a moral challenge. And our main sense of morality comes from our emotions. A lot of times, when a person commits an evil act, they come and they justify it. They say, here's why I did this. Here's why I'm justified. Here's why I'm right for having to done this thing that you think is evil. And because we know that we do this, and because we've heard other people do this, we are incredibly sensitive to this balancing act between reason and justification. When someone does something that appears to us to be bad, and they're giving explanations, is this a reason or is this a justification? Are they right or are they just making excuses? And it's really hard for us to tell. And because of that, our natural inclination is to assume that these responses are in fact justifications. And so we don't tend to listen to logical answers to emotional questions, to emotional challenges. So to have a properly satisfactory answer, we need one that is grounded in our emotions. So how do we do that? How do we actually ground our response in emotions? And the first is to, at least in our own minds, reframe the question. And I think the way that we should reframe the question is this: can we trust God? And I would say yes. You see, what they're really trying to show, what they have to show, is that God is not good, that there are bad things in the world and God must be responsible for those bad things. And this is then enforced by the mystery of God's actions. I mean, at the end of the day, if you come to me and you tell me that this horrible thing happened to you, I can't go to the Bible and look up a book with your name on it and say, oh, well, this says right here that that's why that happened. I can't do that. Short of being given a prophecy, I have no way of knowing the exact reason why God allowed that thing to happen to you or this thing to happen over here. And so because of that, it's easy for us to kind of think that, therefore, there is no explanation. And all these things that I'm saying, all these logical responses I'm giving, they're merely me making excuses for God. So I can't just simply stand here and say, therefore, God has good reasons. I have to actually say, here's why, in the mystery of this, in the not knowing the exact reason, we can trust him. And this is why. Christ is God incarnate. Our God is not a God who is aloof. Our God is not a God who looks down on our pain and say, well, isn't that unfortunate for them? That's not our God. Our God came down in the form of a man, and he lived with us, and he bled with us. He suffered starvation. He suffered pain. He suffered heart loss. He suffered fear. He experienced all those things that we experienced. And he didn't come to the earth as some rich man. He didn't come to the earth in comfort and opulence. That's not how Christ came to the earth. The poorest person in America is probably richer than Jesus Christ was when he was on the earth. And then when he came, he didn't just simply come and enjoy himself. He died on a cross for you and for me. Which means that when I'm following Christ, when I'm obeying him, I'm not being asked to do anything that he himself wouldn't be willing to do himself. Christ doesn't tell us to jump into the flames. He jumps into the flames himself and asks us to follow him in. And because I know that my God is willing to suffer for me, because I know that my God is willing to endure the pain, because I know that my God is willing to have the evil happen to him, I can trust him when it happens to me. And at the end of the day, that's good enough for me. I know that this God loves me. I know that he is with me. And therefore, I can endure all things. I can deal with the pain. I can deal with the suffering that I have in my life. And I can trust him that there is a good reason for everything that happens, even if I can't see what that reason is. And I would encourage you to accept trust in Christ as well. You can trust God, even in those things that you don't understand. He does love you. He does care. And he is good. Thank you. Now, if you have any questions, if there's anything that you want to ask me, you can leave a comment in the YouTube comment section, or you can leave a comment in the Facebook post that this is on. I will be monitoring both of those things through the rest of October. So if you ask a question in those places, you will eventually get an answer. Maybe not right away, but you will eventually get an answer. Also, you can come and talk to me personally. The church is open at 11 a.m. every Sunday. This is our address, 20 Center Street, St. Johnsville, New York, 13452. And also my email is martin.w.glynn@gmail.com. If you wish to ask me any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you very much for watching this presentation, and may God be with you.